Next two classes we're actually going over different saints as examples and trying to see what insights they give, and then the following week we'll go over more saints. So it's kind of the outline of where we'll partake. Tonight we're going to go over four saints: Saint Benedict, Saint Theresa of Lisieux, Saint Theresa of Avila, and Saint John of the Cross. So we'll first start with Saint Benedict. So just to get like some quick background on Saint Benedict and his life. He was born in 840 and 480. It was during the time Rome fell, I believe at 410. The Roman Empire fell in the west, and so basically the barbarians took over, and the structure that the Roman Empire gave had been lost. So Benedict grew up came from a very noble Roman family. He had a twin sister named Scholastica, but the culture was very dysfunctional. Most of the leaders were either heretical, pagan, or outright atheist. So it was not a very Christian-friendly culture. And there wasn't much structure, I guess, which the Roman Empire had before. Even though he grew up from a very noble family, when he became of age, of a man, he actually retracted all his goods and went out into Subiaco in a cave and lived in the cave for 3 years by himself. People would seek his spiritual advice, and you'll find this during this time. This is a very common practice by Christians. They would go out and try to live this ascetic life by themselves. There was a beginning of actual monasteries, of a group of men and women living together, trying to better live the Christian life, trying to get away from this pagan and immoral culture. And eventually some monks got a hold of Benedict and asked him to be their abbot. So an abbot is someone that oversees a monastery. And so he became an abbot of this monastery because the old abbot died. He was very strict on his monks. He enforced really harsh rules, and they didn't like it. So they tried to kill him by poisoning him. So instead of trying to help him, he said, "Forget about this," and he left. He went back to his little cave. And eventually people would come again and ask for his advice, and he decided to try to start his own monastic life. And so the top picture is actually the one in Subiaco. And it's on the side of a cliff. This was the first monastery he found it. And what he did was he would get 12 men, and they would be overseen by abbot or leader, and they would live the monastic life of trying to live out the evangelical counsels of chastity, poverty, and obedience. it actually went very well. And what he did was he wrote this book called The Rule of St. Benedict. And what this book was kind of a guide of how a monastic life should be structured. And he ended up finding a total of 12 monasteries in total. One of them, the first one he founded, a priest was very envious of his success, and they tried to slander him. They tempted the monks there with prostitutes, and again he got tired of it, just left and founded another one. And the last one was Monte Cassio, which is the bottom picture down here. They rebuilt it, so that's where it is presently. So he's the founder of Western monasticism, basically because of his rule. He gave monasteries like an actual kind of guidelines of how to set up a monastic life, how to form the structure, what the day should look like, what the monks should do, how they should treat others, and all of that information, what the abbot should do. It gave different jobs, how to rotate the jobs. It's very practical advice. And the key with Benedict in church history, just on a side note, is it's due to his work that brought the structure to Europe when the Roman Empire fell. It's due to the monasteries, the Benedictine monasteries, that help preserve a lot of the Christian culture. It's actually what eventually developed into the feudal system. These monasteries would get on land, they would build a monastery, it provided protection for the people from the culture that had gone very astray, and she didn't have like police or anything, so to provide protection. And this is actually what developed into the feudal system. So it's despite the fact that after Benedict there's this thing called the Dark Ages. They weren't really dark because it was due to the Benedictine monks that kept Western civilization alive for the Renaissance to even happen. It's just a side historical note. So what can we learn from this rule book about monastic life? I actually really have great respect for what all St. Benedict writes. So the way it's structured is the first 7 chapters are, if you want to call it like spiritual doctrine, and then the next 8 through 73 are more of how the monastic life should be structured. So that's where it goes into the practical side. So what we're going to do is we're going to focus on one little chapter on the spiritual doctrines, and I'm going to hit some main points in the second part. So the first thing from the first chapter, there's 3 key virtues in St. Benedict's writings. There's obedience, silence, and humility. And humility is key. He actually spends in his last chapter, a long length of time about the importance of humility. And we'll find this in all the saints that we covered tonight. Humility and obedience kind of go together. For one to be obedient to someone, they must first humble themselves. So they're seen as can't separate them. And the other key thing about Benedict, because like I said, he's the founder of Western monasticism. There was an earlier form called Eastern, that's still alive, which was extremely ascetical. So it was very penitential, a lot of intense penances. You can read this like in the Desert Fathers. It's a good example of Eastern monasticism. the thing with, if you compare Eastern monasticism with Western monasticism would see it a lot easier. And the key is that Benedict saw the importance of moderation. So an example would be where the Eastern monastics would say, I will just give up all wine. We will not drink any wine. Benedict would say, no, we'll only drink wine once a month. And it's due to our ability that we can drink it once a month, we have greater self-control. I can moderate these things. I don't just need to outright deny them. I can actually moderate them if they're good. But so his thing was always in moderation. To do everything in moderation. So I want to focus on humility. So this may be extremely hard to read. Can you all even see it? Yeah, let me just turn this right. And but what this is the 7 steps of humility, which is found in chapter 7. And I love it because it really shows the importance of humility and how we can go astray from what humility is. So, first, to keep the fear of God always before our eyes, to love not what our will is, but in order to take pleasures and satisfaction, to always submit to the superior, be obedient even under difficult, unfavorable, and even unjust conditions. So to be obedient even when you don't want to, or you feel like you're getting the raw end of the deal. One does not conceal the habit of any sinful thoughts entering his heart. So we're humble of all of our actions. So a lot of times we can just connect this, replace the habit with God, because we don't really have an habit. But we replace, we're always never going to withhold anything from confession. We always confess our sins right before God. The other fun ones that I like, and then we'll move on, is the content with the lowest and most mental treatment, regard himself as poor and regards himself as a poor and worthless workman in whatever task is given. They divvy up all tasks, and you always have to rotate, so no matter what task you had, you always did it diligently and with love. And then the other fun stuff is about controlling your tongue and remaining silent, speaking unless asked a question, not getting ready to laughter. People may think that's excessive, but the one thing I love that we can pull from this is that we don't, a lot of times we can just talk for talking's sake, and we don't really have anything good to say. We just want to talk. To really kind of think about what we were going to say. But those are just little things about humility. The next part I want to go to is how we structure the monastic life. And we can apply this very practically for us. So there's, in the picture it says Saint Benedict or at labora, which means work and prayer. And that's really the motto of the Benedictine life. I'm also at study, but what the Benedictines did, what Saint Benedict did, was he structured the liturgy of the hours, which many the religious were praying, which we still pray today. All priests, all ordained and religious take a vow to pray that. And he structured it that in the beginning of the day you'll pray, you do the divine office, and you pray morning prayer, mid-morning, evening, mid-evening, evening prayer, and night prayer. So the day is structured around the prayer life. The other thing is he had a time of study. So they did usually Lectio Divina, so prayerfully reading the scriptures. And the other thing is everyone was always given time to work. And that work was to support the monks and the poor. So the monks usually, that's where we get a lot of our wonderful brews of beer is from the monks. Not nowadays. Most of this stuff is overly watered down and has no flavor. And it's just there to get people drunk. But these are the three things that gave structure to his life. So I want to kind of give you a practical example. So on the left are two schedules of two Benedictine monasteries. So MAGIX is the divine office. So they wake up and they pray that at 4 o'clock in the morning. At 6 o'clock they pray the morning prayer, which is called lauds. Then they can structure it differently with Mass. The prime, sex, and Therese are the mid, noon, and mid-evening prayer that is found in the Liturgy of the Hours. Then there's evening prayer, which is Vespers, and then compline is called night prayer. But the key is there's 7 times of prayer. You can see Lectio Divina is put up in there, and they all have time to work. So the monasteries still do this today. But the key for us to kind of pull from this is the importance of what a lot of people call bookends. That we have a morning prayer and an evening prayer, or a nighttime prayer, something that we start our day with and something that we end our day with. So it could be the morning offering we start our day with, and then an examination of conscience, or something or it could be as simple as the Our Father. It could be 15 minutes of prayer, but we start our day with prayer, we end our day with prayer, and then also trying to set time throughout the day, even if it's, you know what, at noon, I'm just going to pray an Our Father. We're trying to set up time, real moments in the day, to structure our day around prayer. The other thing is setting time for study. So they always say Lectio Divina, but we can pull any spiritual reading. So we're going over a bunch of spiritual readings. So St. Benedict, St. John of the Cross, St. Theresa of Avila, scriptures, any form of spiritual reading is good. So that could be just 15 minutes a day. And then also finally seeing the value of work. Our work has value, we should do it diligently, we should not just do it half-heartedly when there's actually value in our work. So that's kind of the Saint Benedict in a nutshell. Are there any questions? Okay, so the next thing we'll go over is St. Theresa of Lisieux. We'll primarily use this work of hers, which is the story of the soul, her autobiography. So St. Theresa of Lisieux was born in 1873, and you can see she died in 1897. So she died at the age of 23, I believe. Yeah. She died very young. She had severe case of scoliosis, tuberculosis. She also was born in a very Catholic family. They had 9 children. 4 of them died in infancy. So it was a total of 5. All the 5 were girls. 4 of them all became Carmelites, and another one became a Byzantine nun. So they all the ones that survived became nuns. Her mom died at the age of 4½, very early, and so her sister Pauline really became her mother figure. And so when she became 10½, her sister Pauline entered the convent, which was very a difficult experience. It was like losing her mother twice. When her mother did die, she kind of changed. She became a very overly sensitive child. She writes of how she, if she didn't get her way or what she expected, it wouldn't be like she would throw a fit, but she would be overcome with like a saddened emotion. Extremely sensitive. She actually became sick after Pauline left, but finally at the age of 13, she kind of grew courage to overcome this oversensitivity. You can get this all from the book. I just want to try to go through it as quick as possible. At the age of 15, she joined the Carmelites. She actually had to have a dispensation from the Pope. She was too young. It was not her, like you may think, like, oh, she wrote her own autobiography that's kind of pompous, but it was what all Carmelites had to do. And that's kind of the first manuscript. When you read this, there's 3 manuscripts. That's the first one. And the second one is her writing to her sister, her younger sister, older, but not Pauline. And the third one is right before she dies. So she died at the age of 24. So she's one of the most popular saints next to St. Francis of Assisi. So there's a little bit about background. So her, yeah. Sorry, should have clicked the next button. So she's known for her phrase, the little way. So St. Teresa's little way. So what I want to do is kind of read quotes from her to kind of pull out what this means. So I feel that my mission is about to begin. This is a statement about 2 months before she dies to her sister. I feel like my mission is about to begin. My mission is to make God love as to make God's love as I love Him, to teach souls my little way. It is a little way of spiritual childhood, the way of trust and absolute surrender. So we're going to kind of dive into what this means, because a lot of times people assume that her little ways, like I do little things with great love, which there is some merit to that, but it goes beyond that. There's more in her writings than that. Actually, here's another quote from her that kind of gets written, and I'm going to read the excerpt. Oh Jesus, my love, at last I have found my vocation. My vocation is love. Yes, I have found my place in the bosom of the church. In this place, O God, thou hast thyself given me in the heart of the church. My mother, I will be loved. So this quote comes from her last manuscript, which when you read St. Therese she's a young girl on fire that wants to be an amazing saint. She wants to be a martyr. She wants, so when she's writing this, she goes through all of these saints. I want to be an apostle, a martyr, evangelist, but she can't. She knows all these vocations can be summed up in love. So, I've kind of taken some broad approach, but what I want to do is step back and read some longer excerpts to kind of get at what she means by this little way and what she means by her vocation to love. So the first one is earlier on in her work. She was reflecting on her whole life. I'm going to read 2 paragraphs because this really gets, we get to see what she's talking about in this little way. She said, God designed to teach me this mystery. He set before me the book of nature. I understood how all flowers he had created are beautiful, how the splendor of the rose and the whiteness of the lily do not take away the pure perfume of the little violet or the delightful simplicity of the daisy. I understand that all flowers want to be roses, but nature would lose her springtime beauty, and the fields will no longer be decked out with little wild flowers. So she's talking about these beautiful flowers like roses, roses and lilies, that if you're a flower, you'll want to be the best flower. But God has made these little flowers like daisies, violets, but in the whole beauty of nature, they all have their place. The not so beautiful and the very beautiful. And then she goes on. And so in the world of souls, God, Jesus is guarded. He willed to create great souls compared to the lily and the roses. But he created smaller ones, and these must be content to be daisies and violets, destined to give joy to God's gladness when he looks down at his feet. Perfection consists in doing his will and being what he wills us to be. So, saying God has made great souls like those of the Saint Ignatius, of all these amazing saints, these martyrs that go out and do these amazing things. He also makes little souls that struggle with little things, but they're just as beautiful as the great martyrs. Because again, she was a Carmelite nun who stayed in the monastery all her life. And the key of what she says is, perfection consists in doing his will, in being what he wills us to be. So for Saint Theresa, it's acknowledging how God has created us and being what he has made us to be, not trying to be something else, and recognizing our little weakness, our struggles, and seeking his help, and being, you'll see that this ultimately comes down to humility, really seeing yourself as you are. So another one, on more about this. This is when she's writing to her superior. You know, Mother, I've always wanted to be a saint. Alas, I've always noticed that when I compare myself to the saints, there is between them and me the same difference that exists between a mountain whose summit is lost in the cloud and the obscure grain of sand trampled underfoot by passers-by. So she's seeing the sand as this huge mountain, and she's this speck of sand. Instead of becoming discouraged, I said to myself, God cannot inspire unreasonable desires. I can, in spite of my littleness, aspire to holiness. So what she's saying is, even though I may be this little speck of sand, God would not put this desire in my heart to be this amazing mountain. It is impossible for me to grow up, and so I must bear with myself such as with all my imperfections, but I want to seek out the means of going to heaven by a little way, a way that is very straight, very short, and totally new. And so this is what she describes. We are living now in an age of invention, and we no longer have to take the trouble of climbing a stair. For in homes of the rich, an elevator has replaced these successfully. I want to find an elevator which would raise me to Jesus, for I am too small to climb this rough stairway of perfection. And so she sees that there's no way that she can be this great martyr of saints, but it's by accepting who she is and being humble that God will elevate her up to be this great saint. And it's really what happened. I mean, Saint Theresa died at the age of 24 as a Carmelite nun in France, and no one knew about her. And now she has become probably the second, well, maybe third now, since St. John Paul II is canonized, saint ever known. And like, you look at her and you're like, well, what did she do? You know, she was who she was, and she accepted that, and she let God work in her. And that's really all she did. And everything that she said actually happened. So I want to kind of summarize what this means. So being humble in one's weaknesses and the recognizing of needing God's grace, that we can't do this ourselves. We need God's grace. God wants to find us in our weaknesses. And this is really what humility is. Because a lot of times we can fall into this, I know I do, is, okay, God, you want me to take out this vice, I'm struggling with this. Well, okay, I'll at least do this, this, and this, and then you'll meet me here. Like, I'm down here, but you can't meet me down here. I'll try to do this and this, and then you'll meet me and you'll beat me up. I need to prove myself that I'm worthy. I don't know, that might be me just talking about. I fall into that, like, and what St. Theresa is saying is, no, you accept your weaknesses, you ask for God's grace, and He will meet you at your lowest point to help bring you up. So it's not a total pacifism, it's the key thing I don't want you to come up with. But it's this idea that no matter how low you are, God will always go down to where you are to help elevate you up. Because the key is you're placing your total trust in God, not yourself. You're not saying, well, I'll have to do this and this to earn God's grace. No, God's always going to come down to meet you. So, you go remember her statement, the spiritual childhood there's only these two pillars, the way of trust and the way of absolute surrender. So God will help us in our weakness, in our bitterness, in our little ways. God will always be there. And it's because we're putting our trust in God to help us through this. We're not totally trusting on ourselves. Because the one thing, I didn't read it from here, but she talks of how God only helps those who want to be helped. So if we always put our trust in God, God will always help us out. If we're putting our trust in ourselves, then God's not going to help us. And then this absolute surrender is it's not just recognizing our weakness, but loving it, knowing that, because it's in that weakness that, yes, we struggle, but turning it into a victory, because, yes, I struggle with this sin, but I know I need God's grace, and it's in that weakness that we encounter God, not by doing it, but by submitting that we need His grace to overcome it. Does that somewhat make sense? Or? Okay. So the last two saints we're going to go over are Saint Theresa of Avila and Saint John of the Cross. So have any of you ever read Saint Theresa of Avila, Saint John of the Cross? Okay, I'm going to just tell you Saint John of the Cross. It's kind of, like you read him, and I'm going to try to put some background in him, because you read him and he makes it sound like everything in the world is evil and you must choose the most difficult way. I'll read some section from him, but I love this guy. I think he's awesome. But you have to kind of understand his background of why he's writing this and what he actually means and what he not means. So first, Saint Theresa of Avila. So what was kind of going on here? This is during the, right before the Protestant Reformation, when she was born. And Spain really wasn't as affected by it as most of the countries, but it's mostly because they had the Inquisition. But what was happening is when she grew up, her parents and St. John of the Cross, their parents were Jewish converts. And so right at that time there had been an issue where there was forced baptisms, and what the Inquisition was trying to do was figure out who was validly baptized, because you can't force baptize anymore, and then if they were falling back to their Jewish practice. I'm granted it got kind of out of hand, but so this is the time that they grew up in this, yeah. So at the age of 14, her mother died. Her father did not want her to enter in what we'll call the Carmelite order, but she still persisted, and he finally agreed. And she entered the monastery in 1536 at the age of 21. Her spiritual life didn't really advance until 1550, so that's like at the age of 40. So they can all give us hope that. And finally in 1960, she wanted to join a reform of the Carmelite order, and we'll go over kind of what was going on with the Carmelites and kind of what the reform they tried to do. So this is a little background to her life. St. John of the Cross, his father died right after he was born. Due to his father's death, his family was very impoverished. He was able to go to a Jesuit school though, and he got a very good education, and then he entered the Carmelites. Right when he entered and ordained was ordained a priest, he actually wanted to leave. He saw all the abuse, but he met this lady by Theresa of Avila, and she convinced him to help her reform this order. We'll go into the whole kidnapped and being imprisoned effect. So what was going on with the Carmelites? Well, the Carmelites is a monastic or ascetic order. A lot of times they live in cloisters, so which means that they don't interact with the outside world. They're the prayer source for the church. Well, during their time, their prayer life or structure became very lax, and they allowed visitors to come in frequently, so it totally offset the purpose of what the Carmelite order was supposed to be, and basically be like a Franciscan sort of take possessions and not beg for food, and it's kind of like, well, that's kind of your charism, and you're totally going against it. So they wanted to reform it. St. Teresa had the most success. She ended up founding 17 convents. All they really did was just prevent her. St. John of the Cross had a little bit different experience. He was able to form one house for the friars, and then he was actually captured by leaders in the Carmelite. So these were Christians. They arrested him and imprisoned him for 9 months. They tortured him. They psychologically abused him by saying that Theresa of Avila and all of his friends had recanted, and they all went back to the old ways, and that he should just give up. When they would give him food, they would give him food and then walk away and say, oh yeah, we poisoned it outside the cell, who died in a couple of days when they really didn't. And so they would just play mind tricks with him. He was eventually able to escape through the window with bed sheets, which is funny. When the nuns found him at St. Joseph's, the ones that the convent that St. Theresa of Avila helped found, the first one, they didn't even recognize him. He was that thin and malnourished, but they kind of put a background of his writings. When he got there, he writes of how the sisters began to sing, it's through his suffering we find him, we know his love. And so that's why, like, you can just imagine, you can just experience this 9 months of literal, I don't want to say literal, but a hellish state, and then hearing those words is through his suffering we find his love. So his writing is a little bit more darker. He's known for writing The Dark Night of the Soul, The Ascent to Mount Carmel. But that's just a little backdrop of why he's of that. He really encountered great suffering, and it's through that he grew closer to our Lord through the cross. So I'm going to go over a little bit of the main theme with the interior castle and the ascent to Mount Carmel, and kind of what we can draw through it ourselves. Before I start, I wanted to go over these 3 types of prayers, so I'm kind of use them to help explain this. So there's 3 main types of prayers traditionally. There's vocal prayers, so which we speak through our mind or heart to God, so that's in the liturgy. That can be personal prayer, or group prayer, but there can be formula prayers like the Our Father, the Hail Mary, anything written down. They can be like a journal, but us expressing our thoughts in words. Then there's meditation, where we then are recollecting or reflecting on what God has done or God Himself. So that could be like Lectio Divina, we read the text and then we meditate. It could be like the Rosary, or you read a spiritual book and you reflect on it. That's meditation. Reflect on the truth that there's three persons in one Trinity, and there's this ever-giving love relationship between persons, and digesting that. That's meditation. Vocal and meditation prayers, all prayers that we do. Contemplative prayers is what God does to us. So He is the actor in that prayer. He's the one that elevates our mind and will, our mind and hearts to His. So that's just a quick definition on that, because we're going to be referring back to that. So the interior castle by St. Therese of Avila. There's 7 castles. I'll only go before because it was written mostly for contemplative Carmelite nuns, and most of us, I hate to say this, from a practical standpoint, don't have the time to do that because we're not vowed religious. So if you've gone beyond the 4th step and then just hop on and start reading this, and it's always up to you. But she describes the castle as a crystal globe. And so a lot of times people think it's like this stage castle, but a lot of commentators have described it like this, like an onion, which each castle is you peeling off, growing closer to our Lord who's in the middle. So I don't want to go too far into that. So the nice thing about the interior castle and the ascent to Mount Carmel is it kind of gives us a stage how our spiritual life will develop. So the first one is for the beginners of just trying to live in the state of grace, and not falling into mortal sin, and continuing in just very basic vocal prayer. Then we all encounter this, our vocal prayer is consistent, but we begin to experience this dryness in prayer, where you may not feel the ooey gooey feelings that we get, the excitement or the aha moments. Then it's moved to more acquired recollection. I put meditation prayer, it's more than that, but really sensing of God's, recollecting God's presence, His will in one's life. So it goes a little beyond meditation, and then one begins, like the first kind of taste of contemplative prayer or mystical prayer begins at the 4th layer. So I'm going to just go over kind of those, the next 5, 6, 7 prayers really go more into contemplative prayer, and again, you really, I'm not saying a lay or non-religious can't reach it, because they definitely can. It's just a lot of times you have become too busy in your life. The other one is the ascent to Mount Carmel. What I'm going to do is just briefly address these, and then I'm going to show how they all fit together and try to summarize it. So the ascent to Mount Carmel, don't focus on the glass of water with what was supposed to be rocks, but the thing that actually looks like a mountain. So the ascent to the top of Mount Carmel, God being on top, is an ascent which we take off these these desires that we have for earthly goods, for possessions, for joy, and empty ourselves. And this is where you get this, he always speaks of the nothing, of the nada. It's us emptying ourselves so God can fill us. And us wanting nothing so God can fill us. And the key is, a lot of times, it's not us ascending ourselves, but it's God filling us and elevating us up. So very similar to St. Theresa of Lisieux, we recognize our weaknesses, and it's God, it's His grace that helps elevate us up. So I'm going to just read, this is why I wanted to preface St. John the Prophet, because this is some of his writings. Endeavor to be inclined always, not to the easiest but the most difficult, not to the most delightful but the harsh, not to the most gratifying but the less pleasant, not by what means for rest but to hard work, not to consoling but to unconsoling, not to the most but the least, not to the highest and most precious, but to the lowest and most despised, not to wanting something, but to want nothing. And you may be reading that and thinking, oh my goodness, John must have lived like the most crazy aesthetic life, probably of choosing the most difficult thing. And I just want to preface this, just because if you read him, that's not really what he's saying. I empty myself of all these things because I want God to fill them. Or a good example would be, I love my wife, I want to spend time with her, so I actively make time, I clear things out of my schedule to make time for her. The same as with God, we passionately love God, we must take these things that are roadblocks and not desire them and push them aside so that we can only desire God. So that's why I had this kind of glass of water, because I can't do this. But if you, I don't know if y'all ever seen that, the reenactment, you take a glass and you put rocks in it, and you pour water in it, and only so much water can fill all those rocks, or all the material things that we put in our life. But when we take more rocks out, more water can be poured in. When we take more rocks out, more water can be pulled in. So the more stuff we take out of our lives, the more we can allow God to fill our lives. In a sense, now this whole ascent to Mount Carmel, the interior castles, can all have been summarized in what are called the 3 ways of the spiritual life. So that's called the purgative, the illuminative, and the unitive. And this is very classical spiritual theology. If you want a great book to read on that and summarizing all that, Father Gregory Lagrange, who is a spiritual director to St. John Paul II, wrote this book, The 3 Conversions in the Spiritual Life. And so, it's a really good book. Mine's falling apart, literally. Phenomenal book. Well, the purgative is really like a beginner. So, someone trying to stay away from mortal sin. They're trying to change their lives. So I know I'm gonna, an active way of trying to stop falling into serious sin, staying in the state of grace, doing penance, primarily to gain control of one's desires, because their desires are altered towards sin. That one must gain control. The prayer is usually vocal or meditative, and God is trying to help them. Help this soul who's trying to stay away from what was sin. So God is giving consolation. So we can see this in like the family life. So when I was trying to potty train my daughter, and my daughter did not go in the diaper, we chose M&Ms. We were given an M&M, because we hardly ever give my daughter chocolate. So that's a good thing. I'm trying to reward a good behavior. So God's trying to reward us of this good behavior. We're trying to turn away from sin. So a lot of times in my experiences after a retreat, this over-emotional thing, this great love, our spiritual life is on fire. This is awesome. Like when I pray, I feel really good about myself. I may be doing like acts of charity, and I feel all positive. I'm like, man, this is awesome. And then slowly starts to decrease. And that's really when we're beginning to be brought into the illuminative. So hopefully we conquered mortal sin, and now we're working on venial sin, and God begins to withhold this consolation. So eventually I expected my daughter to go to the restroom without an M&M, because it would be wrong for me to continue to give it to her when she's 22 years old. She should understand that by now, that's good for her, and you don't need to be rewarded. So the same is with us in our spiritual life. We should be seeking God for Himself, not for the consolation, or not for the spiritual cookie, you want to say. And this is really when some contemplation begins. God begins to draw us out, and it's a difficult time when someone gets through it. And a lot of times, the sad thing is when people are put through this trial, because it is a trial, they actually revert, and they change their spiritual practice to get like, because especially in our culture, we like pleasure, we like feeling good. And so we think when prayer leaves us, and we no longer feel good anymore, well then something's wrong. And for me, no, God's actually trying to draw us closer. So we're called to persevere through this trial. And then the unitive is actual going beyond sensual sensations, but actual spiritual consolations are with hope. So this is where we get the phrase like the dark night of the soul. Or if y'all remember after Mother Teresa died, there's that diary, and people were wondering, oh, does she even believe in God? She talks about this doubt of where's God. Well, that's God withdrawing even that sense of His not His actual presence, but the sense of His presence, and still being faithful. Even though I do not feel God's presence, I will still continue to do His work, and seeking Him and His will. So, and we see it that it's a greater act of love to do something for another and expect nothing in return, no spiritual consolation. Does that kind of make sense? So a lot of times when someone's in the unitive way, their primary prayer becomes very contemplative. It does not mean that they do not do vocal prayer or meditative prayer. They do. That's all essential in the prayer life. But a lot of times, like when you read St. Theresa of Avila, I'm pretty sure it's true, when she said the Our Father, right, at the word Our Father, she would already be caught up in contemplative prayer. But again, that's a mystic. So yeah. But the key to kind of see this is this stage of progression. Because a lot of times we'll find ourselves in between these two states, the purgative and the illuminative, and we fall back, or we get that test, we lose that sensation, and we actually fall, or we no longer, well, I know I'm supposed to do this, but I'm not really getting any enjoyability out of it. I still must persist. As a catechist, you get it a lot when you start teaching in middle school. The joy of it is gone, but you're called to do this, so you still must persist and do it with, like Saint Benedict, the full diligence of which you're called to do. So this is going to be a very intense graph. I'm trying to summarize these three ways, St. John of the Cross and St. Theresa of Avila all together. So this diagram kind of summarizes it. The purgative way, or like the beginner, they're trying to first start virtue, trying to turn away from mortal sin. Their purification is active, so they're actually attempting to purge themselves of those sensible sensations such as I'm trying to go, let's just say someone's very gluttonous of actually trying to fast and gain control of the pleasure of food. Women try to actually fast or reorder my desire for food to be in its right state. So it's a very active purification. Their prayer life is mostly vocal and meditative, and this can kind of be summarized by St. Teresa's first two mansions, where in the illuminative virtue is stuck. It's actually something that living in solid passive purification doesn't mean that they're not doing penance anymore. Now, God's actually taking things away, those, like I said, spiritual consolations or essential consolations that we receive in the spiritual life are being taken away for us to show, yes, God, I seek you for your sake, not for the spiritual cookie. And again, they're able to taste some of that contemplative prayer, and then finally it's back to the unitive way of heroic virtue. And this is fundamental. Right? So if you ever read the lives of the saints, these heroic martyrs, these amazing evangelists, missionaries that did these amazing things, they had heroic virtue. Why did they have heroic virtue? Because they had an amazing prayer life. Like, heroic virtue doesn't come by our work, it comes of God's work in us. And so you see this changing of us. We start this, we're the ones that make the choice. We begin acting as very external. God's comforting us, and it slowly goes to, we find out that there's a point that we can't do it. And we have to have God's assistance. And things become more internal, and we've derived ourselves from all those physical pleasures and now our spiritual life becomes very eternal, and we no longer have these consolations, but we have these crosses that we accept and persevere through. And this is really, I think Jason mentioned last time, the big distinction between Protestant spirituality and Catholic spirituality, that we're not just forgiven of our sins, but we're accepting something. There's a change of life where God does not cover us, He changes us. And this is that internal change of us reorientating ourselves away from sin to God, accepting the crosses and persevering through them. And finding that through this thing, we actually find a deeper unity with God. So it's very fitting that it's through these trials, just like our Lord, through His trials, He was able to have redemption. It's through persevering through our trials, we actually grow closer to our Lord. So this is just a summary, and then here's the letter, since we all. So Saint Benedict kind of shows us that our prayer should be consistent. There should be a structure, so we should have good bookends, good morning prayer, a good evening prayer, and that should always be there. And then if we can fill out the day or in the middle of the day, it's great, but the bookends are essential. If you also have time for study, obviously people here, I don't really need to talk too much about that, but it's always good to have that consistent time, making time for prayer, study. Other one was St. Theresa of Lisieux, that our prayer should be humble. We should not come before God showing Him what we've done, but we see our weaknesses and we simply ask God for help. With simplicity and attentiveness is really all of the saints. And then finally, St. Theresa of Avila and St. John of the Cross teach us that even though we have struggles, even when the spiritual cookies are taken away, we still persevere through them. We continue through them. And actually, next week we'll go over St. Ignatius of Loyola, who gives the 14 rules. We'll just go over the first 14 of kind of how one should orientate their spiritual life when they're going through that stage of it's called a desolation. And then finally, the key is always relying on God's grace. And I want to end with a quote, because I think this perfectly summarizes that element of it about relying on God's grace. Because a lot of times we can, I do not want you to walk away from this that, oh, I can't do anything, therefore, God help me. And you become like that story of the boy who be fitting due to the rain. The man that was on the house and he prayed, it flooded, so he had to climb up to the roof and he was praying to God. He said, God, please help me. And someone with the boat came and he said, oh, come on the boat. And he jumped in and said, no, God will help me out of this. And then, so he screams to God, God, will you help me? And someone in a canoe comes and says, no, God will help me out of this. Oh, so the canoe guy goes off, well, it rains some morning, and it's washed up in the water and dies. So he gets to heaven and he asks God, well, why didn't you send any help? He goes, well, I sent a boat and a canoe and you still didn't hop on that. So that's a fun way to say St. Ignatius of Loyola stated, work as hard as if it depends on you. Pray as hard as it depends on God. I think that really strikes about that. We are to be as active in the work as we can, but we need to realize in our prayer life that we should fully depend on God, and we need His grace.